Welcome to the Pan Am Podcast, brought to you by the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York. This podcast and our museum are dedicated to celebrating the legacy of the world's most iconic airline, Pan American World Airways. My name is Tom Betty, and I'm the host of this program. Thank you for joining us. This program is sponsored by the generous support of Mr. Adam Aron, the CEO of AMC Entertainment Holdings Incorporated. The Pan Am Museum Foundation is a nonprofit organization. Please visit our website for more information at thepanammuseum.org. Again, our website is thepanammuseum.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. If you are using Apple Podcasts, please consider leaving a review. It will help others discover this program. If you're not familiar with Pan Am, welcome. We are honored to have you here, and for you to learn about what we're all about. If you already know of Pan Am, worked for or flown on the airline, or just love our history, it's good to be with you again. So with that, let's get this episode in the air, so to speak. Welcome aboard your Pan American Jet Clipper. In this episode, we'll be exploring Pan Am's prestigious role in White House press charters, traveling as part of the entourage of the President of the United States and his aircraft, Air Force One. Then we'll be joined by three special guests. Our first guest is Dwight Chapin, who was a top aide to President Richard M. Nixon. He recently released a book called The President's Man, The Memoirs of Nixon's Trusted Aide. While at the White House, Mr. Chapin helped organize presidential travel and traveled with President Nixon on his historic trips to China and the Soviet Union. A special thank you to Jim Byron and Joe Lopez of the Richard Nixon Foundation for connecting us with Mr. Chapin. We encourage you to visit the Richard M. Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California. Our second guest is Claire Graham, who was a Pan Am purser from 1968 to 1991 when she joined Delta Airlines. Claire was part of the White House press charter flight crew and flew most of the special trips. And last but not least, Captain John Marshall returns to the program to tell us his stories of flying presidential charters and flying alongside Air Force One. But first, here's some history of the important diplomatic roles Pan American World Airways played for the United States government. In 1943, when U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt traveled to Casablanca aboard a Pan Am Boeing 314 flying boat to meet with Allied leaders, Pan Am already had a special relationship with the Department of State and the White House, and this would continue until the airline would close in December of 1991. Later, when there were official presidential planes under the United States Air Force, it became standard procedure that when the president flew on Air Force One, a second aircraft carrying reporters and cameramen would accompany him. Many airlines were interested in such a prestigious contract, but Pan Am was consistently selected because of the airline's extensive global network, vast resources, and experienced and professional crews. The flights were known as White House press charters. Crew members for these flights were screened by the United States Secret Service, and once selected, the pool of press charter crews were closed. These flight attendants came to know the reporters very well on a personal basis and would have their favorite meals and beverages waiting on board the aircraft at the end of the day. Pan Am continued doing work for the White House until the airline ceased operations in 1991. In addition to providing the White House press charters, Pan Am was often called upon to assist the U.S. State Department for special missions. It provided transportation for heads of state traveling to the United States or to other destinations if the leader's national airline did not have the aircraft needed for long-distance travel. Pope Paul VI flew Pan Am from the Vatican to Istanbul in 1966. President Sukarno of Indonesia chartered several Pan Am jets in the 1960s, for his global travels, and Alfredo Stroessner, president of Paraguay, chartered a Pan Am 707 for a state visit to Japan in 1972. In addition to carrying world leaders, Pan Am provided humanitarian assistance around the world. It operated relief flights carrying food and medical supplies to victims of earthquakes and disasters, and organized airlifts during political unrest, evacuating U.S. citizens and embassy personnel. U.S. State Department couriers were often seen aboard Pan Am flights, moving sensitive documents around the world. And on several occasions, U.S. Embassy staff visited local Pan Am ticket offices to send wires back to Washington when the embassy's telex systems were broken. Pan American World Airways was the unofficial national carrier of the United States and served the government many times, sometimes on perilous, secret, and dangerous special missions. The Pan Am Museum, within the Cradle of Aviation just outside of New York City, has an exhibit dedicated to Pan Am's White House press charters. We encourage you to come visit, and we would love to welcome you. Now on to our interviews. Dwight Chapin has been an eyewitness to history for most of his life. From Richard Nixon's 1962 campaign for California governor through his world-changing trips to China and the Soviet Union and epic downfall, Dwight Chapin was by his side. As his personal aide and then deputy assistant in the White House, Dwight was with President Nixon in his most private and most public moments. He traveled with him, assisted, advised, strategized, campaigned, and learned from one of America's most controversial presidents. As Bob Haldeman's protege, Dwight worked closely with Henry Kissinger on the logistics of opening China and preparations for President Nixon's historic 1972 visit. After leaving the White House, he worked for United Airlines and then eventually went to prison over his Watergate testimony. Dwight's book takes readers on an extraordinary historic journey, presenting an insider's view on the Nixon presidency. Dwight shares his memorable experiences in his book with the people who shaped the future: Henry Kissinger, his close friend Bob Haldeman, Zhou Enlai, Pat Nixon, Vice President Spiro Agnew, J. Edgar Hoover, Frank Sinatra, Mark Felt, also known as Deep Throat, a young and ambitious Roger Ailes, and John Dean. His book covers a wide range from Coretta Scott King to Elvis Presley, from the wonder of entering a closed Chinese society to the Oval Office, and concludes with the startling new insights and conclusions about the break-in that brought down the Nixon presidency. There is a link in the episode description to Dwight's website and to purchase his book. And you can also find his book at all major bookstores. Dwight resides in Riverside, Connecticut, with his wife, Terry. Welcome to the Pan Am podcast, sir.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Let's talk about the historic trip to China. Can you tell us about some of the behind the scenes that went into the planning for that trip?
Yes, one of the most interesting parts of it, probably for your audience, would be that when the president first talked about going to China, this was right after the announcement had been made to the nation and to the world that he had been invited by the leaders of China to visit. We had a meeting in the Oval Office, and the president at that time thought that it would be a party of like 8 to 10 people, maybe at the most. His thought being that this was a very official, business-like type meeting. He wouldn't take Air Force One. He would go in with like a Jetstar, which is a smaller airplane, and have a small press pool on that airplane. So everything in the original discussions about the trip was in this kind of very capsulized way. The way it turned out, when we went eventually it was a total of 391 people, a fleet of airplanes, and all of the technical gear and everything. So it evolved over the months that we did the planning from this initial very small group to the large contingency that ended up going.
So, can you tell us a little bit about some of the logistics? You were the president's personal aide. I'm sure there was lots of planning. Pan Am was the press charter for this historic trip. Tell us a little bit about your conversations and work with Henry Kissinger and other White House staff.
Yes, my title, if you want to, during the trip or for the trip, was acting chief of protocol, and my responsibilities were all of the logistics. Henry Kissinger, who was the president's national security advisor, was in charge of all the substance for the trip, but I was in charge of all of the other mechanics of the trip. So what we did was I moved from my office in the West Wing of the White House to the conference room in the bomb shelter that is underneath the main residence of the White House. And I set up shop there with I took one of my secretaries, Nell Yates, went down there with me. And then we started meeting daily with the head of our advance operation, by the man by the name of Ron Walker, the military aids office, the Secret Service, and then the press office. Tim Elborn, who was in charge of all press logistics, worked for Ron Ziegler, the press secretary. It happened to be that Tim had been a fraternity brother of mine at the University of Southern California. We were very close personal friends. And then here we were all of a sudden down in the bomb shelter together working on this incredible trip to China. It was Tim Elborn who came up with the idea for the media, we would take and go out to Boeing and design with them a 747 that would include all of the necessary television studios, radio type studio booths, we called them, and all of the equipment, everything would be self-contained on this 747 we would build it in the United States, and then we would fly it over there so that would be at the airport. And as the news people needed to file their stories and so forth, they would go out to the airport, do so, and it would be transmitted back to the United States. It was Henry Kissinger that says, well, don't get too wrapped up in your plan, because I'm not sure the Chinese would agree to that. So I went over to China in October of 1971 with Dr. Kissinger, and we presented this plan. And indeed, the Chinese did not accept it. They were not about ready to let us come over with a 747 with all the self-contained studios. But what they did was they took our diagram and they built a building that was long and narrow, like an airplane, had all of the studios and everything exactly kind of in proportion to what was on the 747 architectural drawings that we had, and they built it there, and it was a face-saving device for them. And then we brought in all of the technical equipment that was necessary to fill out the studios and so forth. The Chinese wanted to buy all that equipment from us. Our State Department, because of copyright laws and so forth, would not let us leave it there. We took it all back. But the press contingency that went over there on the Pan Am plane, the charters that we had leased, all worked out of this press facility that was built at the airport. So that was part of our planning. Now, The press contingency that went, which relates directly to Pan Am, started off very, very small. So we were originally, Nixon said, well, we're going to have 6, 8, 9 people, and we'll take 3 or 4 press people on the Jetstar. That expanded itself to over 100 members of the press corps that wanted to go on this trip to China. It's not inconsequential that a lot of the broadcast and press entities, the management of those news operations started bouncing their own reporters off the trip because the trip was so hyped in terms of people wanting to go that the management decided they wanted to go. So let's just use as an example the Chicago Tribune, who maybe could have sent 2 reporters. The bureau chief went, and 1 reporter, and they got rid of 2 reporters. I mean, it happened with CBS, it happened with NBC, it happened with ABC. It was kind of a funny situation, and needless to say, the reporters themselves were not that happy. But in any case, we chartered a Pan Am plane, and the Pan Am plane followed Air Force One from Andrews Air Force Base out to Honolulu, where we overnighted, and then we went from there on to Guam. And all of this was for the president to let his body get his body clock get acclimated to ending up in Beijing. So the Pan Am plane carrying all of the press corps went from Guam to Shanghai, where we put on Air Force One a Chinese pilot and radio officer for the trip from Shanghai on into Beijing. And the same thing happened on the Pan Am charter. The Chinese would not let the Pan Am pilots and radio operators fly their plane without having equivalent Chinese people on there for, I guess, national security reasons or whatever. We went into Beijing, and when we got to Beijing, the press unloaded from the Pan Am charter, and at that time, then they went into their hotels in Beijing. They had their own motorcade and so forth, and the Pan Am plane flew back to Guam. So it was in Guam waiting, and it stayed there until the party moved from Beijing to Hangzhou, which was where Chairman Mao had his summer home. It was a beautiful part of China, but the Pan Am plane goes back, shuttles the media from Beijing down to Hangzhou, and then goes back to Guam, and a day and a half later comes back to Hangzhou and shuttles the media from, at that point, to Shanghai, China, leaves again, goes back to Guam, and then I believe it was a 2-day separation there before they came back, picked up the media again, and brought them back to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. But they would not allow the Pan Am plane to remain in China. It always had to move out, wait, and then come back.
It sounds like a logistical nightmare. How did you organize and orchestrate all of this?
Well, because like anything else, a project of this size calls for incredible teamwork. In my book, The President's Man, I give all kinds of credit to the Secret Service, the people in the press office of the White House, the WACA, the White House Communications Agency. This was a team effort. Have in mind that we had traveled with President Nixon all around the world and made several foreign trips. We we knew what we were doing in terms of arrangements. It was just the size and the scope of this was a little bit bigger. Well, actually, not a little bit, a lot bigger. And we just applied. Everybody did their job and they did it well. And it was an event of such consequence that everybody was performing, at their top level. It was remarkable. We would have to deal with little things now and then, but for the most part, everything worked the way that we planned it.
Nixon's trip to China is probably in the top 5 most important historical events of the 20th century. Can you give us some insight on what was going through your mind and the feelings behind the scenes with President Nixon and his staff?
Well, all of us were incredibly excited, and it was like a continual high. And our adrenaline is flowing. We're, as I just got through saying, we're performing at the best we can. So I don't even remember stopping to reflect and say, as to the historicness of it, as much as being using the discipline that had been taught to me, and the procedures that I had learned, working for President Nixon and Bob Haldeman and so forth. It wasn't like we were on automatic pilot, but we were at the top of our game. And so we knew it was special. I write in my book, and I don't know when I came to the conclusion or whatever, but it was almost like there was this kind of this subtle evolutionary transformation of Richard Nixon, the man that I knew as president and so forth, who was very brilliant and a great strategist and so forth. But it was a transition to statesman. I mean, the whole thing lifted everybody. It changed the way he was viewed. Keep in mind, he came back after that trip to China and then the subsequent trip to Russia, and he is very high in the popularity polls, which I think proves itself through the election that came up a few months later in 1970, the November 1972 election. He won every state except for Massachusetts and then the District of Columbia. He carried 49 states. Now, granted, he was running against a rather weak Democratic candidate, George McGovern, but Nixon's popularity and the perception of him coming off of both the China and the Russia summits took him to a whole new level. I don't mean to get way off track here, but it's part of the reason that the Democrats were so determined to try to bring him down. I mean, he was riding so high, and then they had this thing called Watergate that was able to take, and Nixon made his own mistakes there too, and admitted it and talked about it on the David Frost interview. So he apologized to the nation, but he was leveled, if you will, by the Watergate situation. And it's only now, as history continues to review things and take new looks, that we're able to get into proportion the legacy of Richard Nixon.
In your time with President Nixon in the White House, I count 24 countries you visited with President Nixon. And in all of those, Pan Am was there with the press charters. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to travel with the President of the United States?
Well, it's a traveling with the President of the United States is a logistical circus. The press side of it, the charter side of it, the White House had a division called the White House Travel Office. Both Tim Elborn, who was in charge of working with the White House Travel Office, and Bruce Wheelahan, one of the men that worked with Tim Elborn, would coordinate, and the White House Travel Office is the one that would contractually make the arrangements with Pan Am to be the charter. There were favorite people that were part of the Pan Am family, if you will. Certain pilots that were known to the travel office, and they would request those pilots. They would request stewards and stewardesses that had served on previous journeys. So it became kind of part of the White House Travel Office family, if you will. So when a trip would come along, just as it was important for us that we're doing the arrangements for the president, to be knowledgeable and to know how it all worked and so forth, it became equally important to a company like Pan Am that the people that they put on these assignments knew how we worked. So the logistics that Pan Am brought to the thing, and by logistics I should include all the personnel, were people that had experience dealing with the White House people. And this goes back in history, I believe, to President Johnson, who did foreign travel, and President Kennedy, who did a little bit of foreign travel before. So it's a knowledge buildup, and that knowledge is one of the things that led to the continuum of using Pan Am.
Fortunately, today, the public can see both of the Boeing 707 Air Force Ones. One is in Dayton, Ohio, at the United States Air Force Museum, and the second one is at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in California.
Right.
So people can go right on board and see these wonderful aircraft. But my question for you is, what is it like to fly on Air Force One with the President of the United States?
Yes, well, it's luxury at its best, I guess. It's beyond what most people ever experienced. When I flew on Air Force One, there's the presidential compartment. I'm talking about 26,000, 2600. That was our tail number. When the president's on the plane, it's Air Force One, but it was the plane number was 26,000, as I recall. And as you went from the cockpit back, you had the cockpit, then you had the president's suite, which had a bedroom, a bath, and then a meeting room. And then right behind the president's meeting room was the staff compartment. And that's where there were two tables, one on either side of the plane, and then two at each table, two chairs on one side, two on the other, facing it. These are very luxurious, wide leather airline types. You would see it in a first class compartment of an airplane. So one table, at one table on the right hand side as you're going back in the plane would be three people. Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff. Next to him, Bob's assistant, Larry Higby, and across from Bob, myself. So we occupied one table, and then on the table on the other side would be Henry Kissinger if it was a foreign trip, or John Ehrlichman if it was a domestic trip. John Ehrlichman was President Nixon's domestic affairs advisor, Henry Kissinger being national security advisor. So depending upon the nature of the trip, it would be either one of those men. Occasionally, it would be both of them. If Nixon were traveling domestically, but there was a foreign policy implication to it, for example, if he was going out to California and part of the thing was to meet with Lyndon Johnson, which happened, Kissinger might go along because there might be national security questions. At that table would be either a Kissinger aide or an Ehrlichman aide, and usually Ron Ziegler. So that would be the four people that would be occupying that table. In that cabin, we also had a new thing called a fax machine. And the thing that was fun about the fax machine that's kind of interesting, I mean, keep in mind, we have no internet, we have no cellular phones or anything. We have the fax machine, but the fax machine only works when the plane is level. So if we're taking off or we're landing, the way that the fax machine it couldn't be used. So we had to wait till we were level before we could use the machine. And then there were two secretarial desks in that part of the cabin. And that would be occupied by one of the secretaries that either Haldeman would bring along, or in my case, Nell Yates was on board fairly often. And for Dr. Kissinger, we used Muriel Hartley was there. And then so now behind that compartment, there were 2 rows of 2 seats, so 8 seats. And they were, again, the luxury, like first class seats, and they were for VIP guests. So if the Secretary of State were flying with us, or the attorneys general and their wives or whatever, so we had 8 VIP seats, and then behind them we had I believe it was 16 seats for the press pool, and that would include a photographer, a cameraman, a sound man, and then the pool would be made up of an AP reporter or a UPI reporter, and then whoever had the current rotation assignment. It might be ABC, CBS, NBC, and of course, all with cable now available. That mix probably has changed, but that would be the contingency on Air Force One.
What was the food like on Air Force One?
The food was very good. You could have a steak if you wanted a steak. On certain flights coming back from California from the Western White House, we usually had a Mexican lunch or a Mexican dinner that was prepared. But the food was, airline food, but first class airline food.
2 more questions for you. In episode 6 of this program, we covered the 1970 hijackings and the Nixon administration's landmark program of airport security and air marshals on airplanes. Do you have any memories of that event?
My memory is of the hijacking and the national focus, if you will. And I can remember going from my office in the West Wing down into the bowels of the White House, where the Situation Room that we had at that time, and the current Situation Room, it's been updated and everything, but it's generally in the same location. But we had a feed, we had an audio feed, and then there were pictures that came in. And as I recall, it was video. It wasn't excellent video like we would have now, but my memory is of the passengers being released by the hijackers coming down the steps. I mean, that's the image that I have, and the relief that these people were getting off of that plane. I think later the plane blew up, or was blown up, or blew up, or however that happened. But the passengers did escape. But it was high drama, and I just remember going down there and absorbing this. I did not communicate any of that or anything with the president. I would say this: it is not the kind of thing that we've had presidents like President Johnson, in particular, I'm thinking of, but that we've had presidents that would go down there and want to watch it and so forth. President Nixon was the kind of person that would rather remain separate from it and deal with being told about it, so that the emotional connection to the decision making was separated somewhat, so that he didn't get caught up in the emotion of things. I may not be saying that exactly right, but it's an important concept, because a leader has to make the right decisions, and they can't be. If you're sitting watching something like that unfold and so forth, the emotional aspects of it could overtake the logic of how you have to be thinking about it.
Last question for you. So you knew President Nixon personally. You knew Bob Haldeman personally. What kind of people were they? And also, looking back on your fantastic career, what stands out and what are you most proud of?
Oh, wow. That's a complicated question. The last part, I guess I'll answer it first. I think I'm most proud of the salutes I got from the work of going to China. I mean, I worked hard at it. Dr. Kissinger was a phenomenal mentor. And Bob Haldeman, my other mentor, gave me license to work with Dr. Kissinger. And I was rewarded with becoming one of the 10 outstanding young men in the country for my work. So I have to say that that's kind of the crowning achievement. The president himself thanked me, and that was like the stamp of gold as far as I was concerned. As for what the two men that you mentioned were like, President Nixon was an incredibly brilliant man. He was a strategist, a statesman, a good man, a man vastly misunderstood by so many, because the history that has been written is so slanted from the Watergate happening that the other dimensions of him have been lost to date to history. And as I said earlier, I believe that we're into a relook at him and kind of a renewal of. He was incredibly successful. He had a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, but he got all kinds of legislation through. How did that happen? And it happened because he was a consummate politician. He didn't rebel against Democrats. He brought them in under the tent and worked with them. He was very pragmatic, and he knew that his responsibility to the country was to get things done, and there were big things that needed to get done, particularly ending a war in Vietnam. So he gave of his all. He did it for the people, and he was a good man. Bob Haldeman, equally good. Bob Haldeman, completely misunderstood because he had a crew cut and made it look, and the pictures of him that were always seemed to always be used by the media had this element of sternness. Now, he was a tough boss. You read my book, you see that his demand level was unbelievably high. Hurdles that I personally had trouble jumping many times, and he would bang me for not performing at the level that he expected that those people who work for the president of the United States have to reach. If you're going to work for the president, then you damn well better perform, and you better perform at a high enough level. And Bob never let up from that. In his mind, he had one constituent. He wasn't the kind of a chief of staff that went out and went on television and tried to expound upon the president's policies or talk about, what the country should be doing. He had one client, and his client was the president of the United States, Richard Nixon, and he did everything to make sure that Richard Nixon was successful. And Bob was fair, he was honest, but he was tough.
Well, thank you very much for your time. The President's Man, the memoirs of Nixon's trusted aide, Dwight Chapin. You can find it in any bookstore. Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, Tom, and I trust that you got some stuff from this discussion that will be interesting to your audience.
Well, we really appreciate your time, and thank you very much. I read this book, and I couldn't put it down, and I recommend it to all our listeners.
Thank you.
Before our second interview with Claire Graham, we're going to take a quick break with an actual ATC recording of Air Force One on approach to Reno, Nevada on August 31st, 2016. When the president travels, there is a large restricted no-fly zone that surrounds him and his aircraft, and airports essentially shut down until the restrictions are lifted. The clip is about 3 minutes long. Let's take a listen.
Hotel approach, 419.2. 19-2, Air Force One, good day. Local approach, good afternoon. Air Force One is with you, passing flight level 195 for 16,000. Information, Mike, requesting the ILS X-ray.
1218, runway 16 right, taxi via Alpha, taxi without delay.
Alpha 16 right without delay, American 1218.
Runway 16 right, cleared for takeoff.
Cleared for takeoff 16 right, Delta 867. The localizer, descendant post discussion, maintain 10,000.
Heading 240, pilots discretion down now, 10,000, Air Force One.
Air Force One, turn left heading 230.
Left turn 230, Air Force One.
American 1218, would you rather return to the gate?
Ground Southwest 2323 is 5 for push for Vegas.
2323, it'll be a while. TFR is in effect, so is the ramp freeze. So I'll monitor this frequency, and I'll let you know when we can get you that time.
Lovely.
Delta, cross runway 16 left, and hold in the Charlie loop at Delta.
Okay, so we get Delta cross 16 left, holding the Charlie loop, American 1218, got it.
Definitely, we're on the northbound, but like to go north on Alpha and into 16 right to the suite.
Op 7, proceed on runway 16 right, cross runway 25.
Op 7, proceed on to 16 right, cross 25.
Sorry, American 1218.
American 1218, go ahead.
Yeah, it's going to be okay for us to shut down here, and you want us to stay on your freak or ground?
American 1218, approved as requested.
And we'll stay this freak?
Affirmative.
Thanks. Romeo, NorCal approach, are you on frequency? November 51 Romeo, reply not received, acknowledged by IDEN. 645 on Romeo. November 51 Romeo, turn left heading 360 for traffic. 45 Romeo, turning left 350 for traffic. Air Force One, turn left heading 190, join the 16 right localizer.
Left 190, join the 16 right localizer, Air Force One.
Sure. Cleared ILS X-ray, runway 16 right approach.
8,400 total tablet cleared for the ILS X-ray, 16 right, Air Force One. So, just getting boarded up here. I thought I'd call you a little bit early, see what's going on with the TFR. What it looks like as far as getting out of here.
Yeah, 5442, it just went active, so it's going to be, I would say, 30 or 40 minutes until the TFR is not in effect and the ramp freezes are lifted.
Okay, 30, 40 minutes before the TFR is up. Appreciate that, Chris.
Air Force One, contact Reno Tower, 118.7. Have a good day.
Air Force One, Reno Tower, good day. And Air Force One is with you, 12 miles on the ILS X-ray, 16 right, final.
Air Force One, Reno Tower, wind 200 at 20, gust 29er, runway 16 right for land.
Clear land, runway 16 right, Air Force One. Wind check, please.
Air Force One, turn right, your discretion, taxi to parking, cross runway 25.
Air Force One will take a right at the end, taxi to park, we'll clear to cross 25.
Welcome back. Claire Rump Graham grew up in Northern Ireland. She moved to the United States in 1964 when she worked at the British Embassy for the Royal Navy. She then joined Pan Am in September 1967 as a stewardess. 6 months later, she was promoted to purser, a position she would hold the rest of her flying career at Pan Am and later Delta Airlines. Claire was a senior member of the White House Press Charter Pool and worked many presidential trips. She resides in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us on the Pan Am podcast, Claire.
Thank you, Tom. I'm happy to give you some memories of my amazing honor of being on the White House Pan Am press charters.
Well, I am excited to learn about it. We had Dwight Chapin on the program earlier, and he worked for Richard Nixon until March of 1973. I understand that you did 3 trips with the Nixon White House starting in 1974, and then you went on to do White House charters for President Ford, President Carter, President Reagan, and President Bush. Why don't you take us back to the first White House press charter with the Nixon administration, and then share your stories of these White House press charters with Pan Am?
I'll just tell you how it went, Tom. We reported to Andrews Air Force Base, 4:00 in the morning. I drove to Andrews Air Force Base. In those days, you just had to show your ID at the gate and take your luggage. You could walk straight across to the Pan Am plane that would have been there overnight, probably with the pilots. So at those days, the crew were based mainly in Washington. We would climb on board our flight, of course, and get ready for the press. But we had time left over after we had checked everything, all the food, and got all of everything ready on the plane. We'd have some extra time. So sometimes we could go across and go onto Air Force One. Can you imagine? We walked up the stairs and there'd be somebody there to say hi. Often the captain, the crew of Air Force One would be on board too. And so we got to know the pilots on Air Force One by name, and then we got to know the crew, and we'd often go on a little tour of Air Force One, which was pretty amazing. They had the same crew, of course, as they did on most of my White House press charters. And we could go through Air Force One and chat to everybody. I'll always remember there were the latest photographs of whatever president it was then all over the plane. And I just can't tell you how interesting it was to see the inside of Air Force One. It was pretty amazing. And looking back on it, that actually we could go on board and talk to people and see the inside of Air Force One. Then we would be there waiting probably until like 7 a.m. for the press to arrive. The whole of the White House staff who were traveling on that trip with the president. However, some of the press came on our plane, which they were very happy about. So if they were assigned to the Pan Am press plane, they didn't have to be part of the pool of White House press on board Air Force One. So everybody was very happy if they were going to be on the Pan Am plane for that flight, for that trip. It changed backwards and forwards. And our plane was affectionately called the zoo plane because truly it was a zoo. And, I don't even know if I can say this to you because all the regulations went out of the window. People were standing up on takeoff, landing. There was equipment piled against the doors. People had a Bloody Mary in their hands. Not us, obviously, but it was not like any flight I've ever known. The nice thing is that we got to know each other. I think they liked that too. We became friends. That was an important part of the White House press office chartering a Pan Am plane. They turned first to Pan Am, and we had a wonderful man called John McSweeney, and he was the go-between Pan Am and the White House press office. And they would, between John McSweeney and the press office, would set up the Pan Am charter. And that was a huge job for them. And the commissary and everything that a Pan Am White House charter involved was incredibly challenging. And I just can't, all we had to do was get on Swan on board and, and work. And that was so easy and fun. And they were wonderful, fabulous days and memories.
So did you meet any presidents on some of these trips?
Yes. Oh, yes. I never actually met President Nixon. He was really under the gun those last 3 trips. The first trip was to Pompidou's funeral. Second one was a huge trip. It was a 10-day trip to Salzburg, Cairo, Jeddah, Damascus, Tel Aviv, Amman, the Azores, and back to Andrews. And the final trip was to Moscow to meet Leonid Brezhnev.
And this was all President Nixon's trip, correct?
Yes. So I didn't meet him. I don't think he was that keen to meet anybody at that point. I did meet President Ford, Jimmy Carter, President Reagan. I was invited along with our crew to the White House to a reception and lunch to meet President Reagan. And that was wonderful. We all met him, shook hands with him. And that was a very special that he wanted to meet us. And then I did meet President Bush on a flight. After flight, I think it was Saudi Arabia, but I did meet all 4 presidents, but not President Nixon. I'll just tell you what we did for fun on a lot of these trips. For example, we flew into Cairo, and we bought kaftans. And so we took off our uniform and wore kaftans for that leg of the flight, and probably for the next leg, because it was so comfortable. So we tried to wear the dress of the countries. This is the whole crew, the Pan Am crew, tried to wear the dress of the countries we were flying to. And the press liked that a lot. And of course, we loved it because we could, get comfortable because they were very long days and nights. And one time we flew into Jeddah and we went to the souk and we bought burqas, and we dressed up in burqas. And when the press came back to the plane, there we were in these black burqas. They were dying to get on board. They were so happy. They'd had such a long day. They were exhausted. And the first thing they wanted was a drink. And we said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We're not allowed to serve any alcohol because we're in Saudi Arabia." We were joking, of course. And their faces fell. "Oh my God, we can't have a drink. We need a drink. It's been a really, really long day." So that was a huge joke we played on them. And of course, we soon gave in and gave them cocktails. I mean, they had a terrible, was a long, long trip. So we had a lot of laughs, changing into, if we could, find the costume of the country. We went to Tokyo. I forgot. Did go to Tokyo, and we wore kimonos, and that was fun too. It was just fun not to wear our uniform.
And were there Secret Service on your plane?
Not that I recall. They were always on Air Force One. So, Tom, we had amongst the journalists who one would remember, or who I remember, we had Helen Thomas, Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Walter Cronkite, Mike Wallace, Tom Brokaw, Barbara Walters. So really, Barbara Walters and Helen Thomas were the first women reporters that we had in those days. Later on, of course, there were more women reporters, but in those days, they were mainly the men that we had on board. And we got to know them, and they got to know us, and they knew our names, and we were sort of one big, happy, tired, usually, family. We had really long duty days, probably highly illegal. We served fabulous food. They loved our plane for that reason too, apart from being on the zoo plane where they could sleep and drink and laugh and do anything they wanted. We had wonderful food, like first-class food. And we usually had the favorite drinks of certain people that requested them. So Pan Am really did make a huge effort to sometimes please the wants of certain passengers.
What planes were you flying? Were these 747s?
Yes. The first plane was the 707, then it was the 747. And that was when, of course, much larger plane, and the crews got bigger and bigger, and they would change the configuration. So it was still very comfortable for the press. It was more of a challenge in every way for the seats and the food, the catering, and the pilots, double pilots. But it still was a fabulous thing to see a Pan Am plane land in some foreign destination. So that must have just been quite a sight to see 2 or 3 747s on the aircraft in some of these countries, like Saudi Arabia or Jeddah we went to, or other countries, to see these huge planes landing with the press, and to be particularly proud of the Pan Am logo.
So you worked for Pan Am for over 24 years.
Yes.
And you were on these prestigious press charters,
yes,
or presidential trips. Looking back on your career, what makes you proud?
Oh my gosh. Well, those press charters were the highlight of my career. I was so proud to be invited to fly on many, many of those trips. and also domestically sometimes on the campaign trips with whatever president was campaigning. But so proud of Pan Am, so very proud of Pan Am, and that they carried off these amazing trips seemingly without a hitch, were always there when they should be. I don't know, some places, how they manage the catering, goodness knows. And just to see, as I said, the Pan Am plane and our uniforms, we had our uniforms then, and the crew, it was a team effort. It really was. And as I say, we all got to know each other and loved, happy, amazing memories, and proud that I was part of the White House press charters.
Anything you'd like to add about presidential press charters and also in general about Pan Am?
Of course, I was terribly sad when Pan Am went under. That was for all of us with Pan Am. That was terrible days when we found out that we didn't represent Pan Am anymore. But they were incredibly happy days too. I mean, I flew many other trips that I loved, and I loved my job. I can really say I loved it. There were difficult days, but I personally loved my job. I'm so glad I did it. At that age, one did not, as a woman, you didn't really have much of a choice of a career. You could be a secretary or a teacher or a nurse or a stewardess. So I was fortunate enough to be chosen for Pan Am and fly for Pan Am. And I've never regretted that wonderful opportunity.
Well, Claire, thank you very much for your time. This was very interesting. I mean, you've flown with 5 presidents. You were able to meet 4 of them. I mean, what an incredible career that you've had. And thank you very much for coming on the program and sharing your stories about presidential flight charters.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for volunteering to do these podcasts. It was very nice talking to you. I so enjoyed my White House press charters and all the crews I flew with and all the people I met, meeting various presidents. Just the entire experience made Pan Am stand out for that, because that was the first. Pan Am, the only airline they really wanted first to charter for a White House trip. They would sometimes have TWA in those days, but it was the first airline that the White House requested. So thank you, Tom. Thank you for doing this.
Well, thanks again for coming on the program.
Thank you.
Before our interview with Captain Marshall, we're going to take a quick break with a 3.5-minute clip from a 1977 Pan Am film promoting the 747 and the 747 SP. In the spirit of this episode, First Lady Pat Nixon christened the very first Pan Am Boeing 747 in Washington, D.C. on January 15th, 1970.
1970. Having led the world into the jet age, Pan Am tops itself. Working closely with Boeing, Pan Am develops a huge new aircraft, far exceeding in size and capabilities anything that anyone had ever dreamed of. The Boeing 747, with room for 2.5 times as many passengers as the 707, and able to fly faster, higher, and farther. It will also prove to be safer, more comfortable, and easier to fly than any long-range aircraft ever built. (1976). Pan Am continues to set the pace by bringing out the new 747 SP for special performance. 47 feet shorter than the standard 747, it has the longest range of any commercial aircraft. It is the first aircraft to offer non-stop service between New York and Tokyo, from San Francisco to New Zealand, and from Australia to San Francisco. On May 1st, 1976, it shows the world what it can do. A Pan Am 747 SP takes off from New York on a record-breaking round-the-world flight. Making only 2 stops, at Delhi, India, and Tokyo, it is back in New York 46 hours later, having broken the old record by over 15 hours. But speed, just for the sake of speed, has never been Pan Am's goal. The goal has always been to take people where they want to go, comfortably and safely, at fares people can afford to pay, with schedules that make it possible for the average person with a 2-week vacation to go anywhere in the world. As Pan Am led the way to the Caribbean and into Central and South America, across the Pacific to Asia and Australia, over the Atlantic to Europe and Africa, around the world, and finally into the jet age, it was doing more than opening up hundreds of new routes. It was opening millions of minds to the idea of going places far from home. This year, Pan Am will carry over 8 million passengers to 92 cities on 6 continents, making what was once restricted to the wealthy few available to everyone. That is what the Pan Am story is really all about, and the best chapters are yet to come.
Captain John Marshall is featured in Episode 2, The First Presidential Flight and the Last Pan Am Flight, and also in Episode 15, Pan Am International Flight Academy and Stories from the Flight Deck. He joined Pan Am in 1964 and would go on to fly many White House charters in his career and was able to handpick his crews. Captain Marshall was with the airline until the very end in late 1991. Afterward, he continued flying 747s for Korean Airlines until 1996 due to mandatory retirement. Since 1996, he's worked for the Federal Aviation Administration in St. Louis, Missouri. It's a great pleasure to welcome you back. This is your 3rd time coming on the program. Captain Marshall, welcome back to the Pan Am podcast.
Thank you very much, Tom. Very happy to be back.
So we had earlier in the program, we had Dwight Chapin, who was President Nixon's trusted aide. And then we had Claire Graham, who was the Pan Am flight attendant, which I believe you know, who worked the White House press charters. And you also worked the White House press charters. So let's start with a typical trip with the White House. Can you walk us through your day?
One trip that comes to mind was a long Far East trip. This was President Carter, and it was in 2 parts, 2 segments really. The first segment was from Andrews, which was the Air Force Base serving Washington, D.C., which is where Air Force One was based. From Washington to Anchorage, where there was a crew change and a fuel stop. And then from there, they went on to Tokyo for, it was a G7 economic summit, as I recall. In those days, the Air Force One and the press charters were flown by 707s. This was in the late 70s, as I recall. The departure was mid-morning, as I remember, and we flew down ferried the airplane down from Kennedy that morning, met the flight service crew. The flight attendants that operated the press charters were all pretty much handpicked, and they were by the White House, and they were all based in Washington. And as far as the pilots were concerned, there were two captains that flew them in those days. There was myself and the gentleman named Bill Hurley, who had done it, who preceded me, and he and I did most of the ones during the time when I was flying. The White House liked the continuity of the crews because it made it easier for them to vet them, and by having the same group of flight attendants all the time, there was a continuity to the press corps as well. And over time, the flight attendants all got used to what the various members of the press corps ate and drank and what their preferred beverage of choice was. And at the end of the day, when they all traipsed back onto the airplane to go back to Washington or wherever, the girls would always meet the press at the top of the stairs with whatever their favorite drink was. It was, and the press really enjoyed that. But we landed at Andrews, and we parked very close to to Air Force One. And of course, nothing happened until the president arrived, and he typically arrived in a helicopter. And as soon as the president's right foot hit the bottom step of the ramp up to the airplane, they started the engines. And as soon as he was aboard, the door was closed, the ramp was pushed back, and they taxied out. Once he was aboard, they didn't wait for anything. And the press, for the most part, at Andrews was already aboard our airplane. And so we took off shortly after Air Force One, and we both kind of flew in tandem to Anchorage. And we did an interchange along the way. The interchange was a process that we used almost all the time. And it involved Air Force One departing prior to the press. And then en route, we would pass Air Force One so that the press could land and cover the arrival. Also, there was a protocol that required at least a photo pool and a journalistic pool. It was just a few people that was required to cover live every presidential departure. In the case of disaster, that there would be a contemporary record of what happened. Thank God we never had to use that, but that was the way the system worked. And when we were at an outstation, it was always a scramble to get all the rest of the press back on the airplane after Air Force One left, so that we could take off and do an interchange, particularly on a short leg. It was kind of a hustle. The way it worked was we coordinated with the Air Force One pilots beforehand, and they took off, and they cruised at a very leisurely Mach number. And sometimes, depending on the situation, they would even sort of kind of make big S turns around while we caught up and passed them. We would run it up to the barber pole and fly at about Mach 8.6 until we passed Air Force One and had a comfortable cushion when we landed at the other end, so the press could get out and cover the arrival. And we coordinated en route frequencies and so on. And it got to be, a pretty routine operation once we got to know the Air Force One guys, and they got to know us. And this particular trip, as I remember, my crew and I were getting off in Anchorage, and Bill Hurley and his crew were getting on to take the flight on to Tokyo. And it was a beautiful, beautiful midwinter day going into Anchorage, and the visibility up there was about 100 miles. You could see just forever, and the view was absolutely spectacular. And we made a visual turn in over the Turn Again Inlet there to land on a runway 14 in Anchorage. And as we turned final, I realized that there was a kind of a commotion going on in the cockpit behind me, and I looked over my shoulder, and there were about 8 people crammed into that 707 cockpit, all the press guys. Every one of them had a drink in their hand, and the guy sitting behind me on the jump seat had a martini in one hand and a camera in the other. And I just leaned back and said, "Hang on, guys." I said, "I'll try and make it smooth." But we flew with the cockpit door open. And we usually had a steady procession of people in and out of the cockpit, just to chat, unless it was at night and it got to be too distracting, then we'd push the door closed. But the cockpit was always available to anyone who wanted to come up there. So we it was such a rush being around that kind of power, and the crews were always the Air Force One crews and the Secret Service people that we traveled with were an absolute delight. And like I said, we had kind of a hand-picked group of flight attendants who were equally dynamite. And Claire Graham, whom you mentioned that you interviewed earlier, Claire was a purser, a senior purser, British girl, who was absolutely wonderful. And I flew a number of trips with her. I'll tell you another story about Claire. We were on a campaign trip there again in the Carter days, where we took off from Washington, and we made several stops during the day. It was a domestic trip. And the last stop was at some place up in New Hampshire, Manchester, sticks in my mind. And Carter was notorious for never keeping to a schedule. And he was late getting back to the airport as usual. It was the last stop of the day. And it was a long day, an exhausting day for everybody, the press included, and us. And the press got on board, and the girls, as usual, they had the guys would hit the top step, and the girls would have their favorite drink, wherever it was, whether it was a martini or a beer or a glass of wine or whatever, handed to these guys as they stepped on the airplane. And we took off, and since it was the last flight of the day, there was no interchange involved, and Air Force One took off, and they hightailed it for Andrews. And we took off not too long after them, and air traffic control treated us as sort of an entry, and they called us not long after takeoff. And they said, "We can give you direct Andrews if you like, Clipper." And so I said, "Yeah, okay, we'll take that." And I called Claire up to the cockpit. I told her we had about an hour and a half because she had a full dinner to get served to everybody. And I said, "Claire, we've just been given direct Andrews, so instead of an hour and a half, it's gonna be about 50 minutes." And her face
fell. No.
And she said to me, "John, you can't do this to me." She said, "I've got a full 4-course steak dinner out there with drinks and everything, and you expect me to do this in 50 minutes?" And I said, "Claire, what's more important, a quick trip to Andrews or your dinner?" She didn't miss a beat. She said, "My dinner." So I called air traffic control and I said, "Can you send us out over the Atlantic and put us in a holding pattern for about 45 minutes or an hour until we finish dinner?" And we heard these guys laughing at ATC. That was a request I don't think they got very often. So we went out there and we made great big lazy circles until I got the high sign from Claire that dinner was over and we could go back in and land. And so all's well that ends well. Everybody was happy.
So Air Force One call sign is obviously Air Force One. On these trips, these White House press charters, were you still called Clipper and then the flight number?
Yes, we were assigned a specific flight number. Air Force One is any airplane that the president happens to be riding in. And as an interesting aside, when Nixon resigned and Ford offered him the use of the airplane to fly back to California, Nixon's resignation was not effective until noon on that particular day. And he went out to Andrews and they took off at about 10 a.m. And of course, he was still president, so it was still Air Force One. At noon, they were somewhere over the middle of the country, somewhere over Kansas. And at the stroke of noon, the call sign of the airplane changed from Air Force One to whatever the tail number of the airplane was.
Interesting.
Yeah. Air Force One itself, the airplane itself was in those days, it was a 707. I did fly a couple of charters after they had changed to the 747. And you cannot imagine the facilities and the equipment and the security measures and everything that are involved in that flight, to say nothing of the luxurious quarters for the president and his staff. It's really something to see. Of course, the girls always loved to fly those charters because the press corps was a bunch of fun people, and they enjoyed our people as much as we enjoyed them. But as I said earlier, it's a heady thing to be, around that kind of power.
With these press charters, in any presidential trip, there is heavy orchestration and precise planning. Can you talk a little bit about the planning that went on between the two crews, the Air Force crew that was flying Air Force One and your Pan Am crew?
Well, we were involved primarily with the interchanges, and of course, for obvious reasons, it was they certainly wanted to have the press as close by as possible, because the press is what politicians live on, and so they were very, very careful to make sure that we were all on the same page and everything. I remember once we were flying out of Kennedy, I think whoever the president it might have been Reagan, had been in New York for a lunch meeting or something, and they were going on to some other destination. And so our airplane, the Air Force One, and our airplane was parked at Kennedy. And when they got back from whatever the function was, the press was in several different buses. There's always a press pool that travels on Air Force One, and then the rest of them are on our airplane. The president showed up, and they were on board and out of there, just lickety split. And we were still rounding up people, and our people at the Pan Am hangar at JFK weren't used to turning an airplane with that kind of pace, and we ended up with a real scramble to get the press pool, the departure pool on the airplane, and then we had a hot start on one of the engines, and so we ended up considerably a little bit further behind the power curve than I would have liked. And I remember that trip, the guys in the Air Force One were kind of pulling my leg a little bit about the reliability of our airplane. And they ended up, I think they almost had to make a 360 so we could catch up to wherever the next leg was. I can't remember. And but one of the perks of flying overseas press charters and going back into Andrews, there's no customs, and the flight attendants love that. Coming back from the Far East on that trip that I mentioned earlier, when we started out going to Alaska, my crew and I deadheaded to Tokyo about a week, or to Honolulu about a week later, to pick up the trip on the way back. They were coming nonstop from Seoul, and when they landed in Honolulu, and we were doing the crew change and the fuel uplift and catering uplift and everything, and I got to chatting with some of the girls, and they were telling me what they'd bought over there in Korea, and one girl had bought 3 TV sets. And it went on from there, and because the lure, of course, being the fact that there was no customs back at Andrews. So when we left, I said to the flight engineer, I said, "You better make figure it for maximum gross weight. I don't know what the numbers are going to say, but just figure it for max gross weight based on what I'd heard the girls talking about, what they had brought with them. So we took off, and we were going nonstop to Andrews from Honolulu. It's about a 9.5, 10-hour flight. And we taxied out to the reef runway there in Honolulu, that 8 right, the long runway that takes off out over the lagoon. Air Force One had long gone. We started the takeoff roll, and we rolled and we rolled and we rolled, and we didn't seem to be accelerating very fast. And I had the vice president of flight ops sitting behind me in the jump seat, who was a good friend of mine. And finally, I almost had to pull the airplane off the runway at the end. And as soon as the wheels left the ground, the stick shaker went off. And I was afraid to raise the gear because I didn't want to put those big gear doors out there in the slipstream. And we went whistling across that lagoon at about 200 feet. The stick shaker going on and off. And we finally got it cleaned up, and it took us over 45 minutes just to get up to 29,000 feet. It was an excessively long time. And when we finally let our breaths out, I turned to Jim sitting on the jump seat behind me. And I said, "What do you think this thing really weighs?" And he said, "Boy, I don't think we want to know, but thank God for Pratt and Whitney." And when we got to Andrews and I saw what came out of the belly of that airplane, I was absolutely astounded at the TV sets and the electronics and the brass tables and this and that. Good Lord. To this day, I'll never know, but I sure would like to know what that airplane weighed.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
So looking back, you've had a very distinguished Pan Am career, Korean Airlines career, FAA career. But looking back at these White House press charters, what memories really stand out to you?
Well, I'm not sure that you could say that there was any really one, Tom. They were just, it was just a real privilege to be invited to be one of the few guys that flew those. The captains were permitted to pick their own crews by pilot, the co-pilot and flight engineer. We didn't have any say in who the girls were, but I picked my own first officers and my own engineers, which was a nice perk. And it was just it was a perk, and it was just a really fun thing to do. I flew one of the trips that was under the auspices of the White House Travel Office was when Deng Xiaoping was here, and that was in 1978, as I remember. It was the first time the Chinese leader had ever come to the United States. And a couple of years earlier, Nixon had made a trip to China earlier than that and set some of the wheels in motion. But the Chinese government had bought several 707 airplanes. And Deng Xiaoping and his entourage showed up in one of the Chinese 707s. And we flew the charter for the press that started in Atlanta when the Chinese went to the Lockheed plant there at Marietta in Georgia. From there, we went to Houston, and we were there for 2 or 3 days while they did a big tour of the Space Center down there in Houston. And while they were there, they were hosted at a country rodeo way out, 40 or 50 miles from Houston. We all went out there in a bus to go to the rodeo, which was great fun because this Chinese delegation showed up, and they put all these little Chinese guys in stage coaches and buckboards and put these huge 10-gallon hats on them. And they looked absolutely ridiculous. But we flew a parallel charter with TWA. They had a 707, and we kind of flew side by side. They flew half the press corps, and we had the other half. And then from Houston, we went up to Seattle, where the Chinese toured the Boeing facilities. And I remember when we were in Houston, we had the airplanes parked at Ellington, which was a not the big commercial airport. It was an Air Force facility there in Houston. And we were parked right behind the Chinese 707. And we got out there the morning we were going to leave. We got out there fairly early. So we thought, let's go over there and see if we can get on board the Chinese airplane. So we walked over there, and there was a boarding ramp up to the front door. And there was a couple of guys on the airplane. So we motioned, was it okay to come up? So they, motioned us up into the out of the airplane. They wouldn't let us go back in the back. They kept saying special airplane. But they did let us take a look in the cockpit, and it was the standard Boeing 707 cockpit, except they had a great big nav table back in the back with a telegraph key that looked like an old Wild West telegraph key you'd see in the railroad office in about 1880 somewhere. And that's what they used to communicate with home base. We flew up to Houston, or up to Seattle the following day, and we had a Chinese television crew that was on the airplane with us, and they wanted to do a film interview on the airplane. So we invited them up to the cockpit. Very, very interesting. I guess we were on the Chinese evening news at some point. But it was so much fun flying with the TWA guys, too, because interestingly enough, we were in Seattle for about 3 days, and the White House press office just pulled out all the stops for us, and they arranged tours and made restaurant reservations for us and so on. And we went together with the TWA people. Years later, after I had retired and quit active flying, and I was working with the FAA, and I was flying as an FAA inspector on a TWA flight to LaGuardia. When we got to LaGuardia, I got to chatting with the captain, and he wanted to know about my career with Pan Am. Well, one thing led to another, and it turned out that he was the TWA captain on this Chinese charter.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And my God, as soon as he mentioned that, I recognized him and remembered his name. And about 2 weeks later, I got a envelope in the mail from him, and he had a photo that was taken in Seattle of he and I and our cockpit crews and a couple of our flight attendants along with us there in Seattle, getting ready to go out to dinner. And so,
wow, that's great.
You talk about a small world. It really is.
That's great.
Yeah. And
these White House press charters sound very interesting.
Oh yeah,
very interesting.
Every place we would land, especially on the domestic campaign trips, when we would park the airplane, the first thing that would happen was some guy would come walking out from the terminal building or wherever we were parked there with a telephone on about a 200-foot long cord. This is long before the days of cell phones or satellites or anything like that. And he brought this phone up and he set it on the seat behind me in the cockpit. And I said, "What is that?" The first time I ever saw that, I said, "What is that?" He said, "That connects directly to the White House switchboard. And if you pick that phone up, the White House switchboard will connect you to any phone number anywhere in the world instantly." And so I picked up the phone and I called my mother. I said, "You never guess where I am." And I told her I was sitting in my cockpit flying with the presidential press corps and a White House charter. And for a long time, she didn't believe me.
That's great.
Yeah.
That story made my day. That's a great story. Very good. Anything you'd like to add about White House press charters?
No, we were in those days. Pan Am flew the great bulk of the overseas charters and many of the domestic charters for the reasons I've mentioned. The White House liked the continuity of the crews, so it made their vetting of the crews easier, and plus they knew that as management pilots, we were not at the end of our contractual duty day. We were not going to just shut the operation down and refuse to fly, which apparently some airlines, domestic airlines, which will remain nameless, they had a couple of bad experiences with that when they would put these press charters out for bid to the regular pilot group, and they got a couple of union guys on there who would not fly past their contractual limits and essentially just left the press corps stranded.
Huh.
So
wow.
They didn't fly many more, but that's one of the reasons that they like to have Pan Am do them, because we were a known quantity and because the continuity of the crews, especially the flight attendants. I think they had a corps of about 30 of the Washington base flight attendants. I think they were still stewardesses in those days, that they picked from to fly these trips. And they were delightful gals. And Claire Graham was a good example. So, and we just had just a wonderful good time. It was a departure from regular line operations, and it was, just out of the ordinary. I remember flying a campaign trip. I think it was with Carter, going from Kansas City to Chicago. Carter was late as usual because he wanted to make a stop at a barbecue place on the way to the airport. And we were headed for O'Hare. And we took off and we went, we had to hustle with the interchange because we were running late. When we got to Chicago, we contacted O'Hare approach control, and it was about 5 p.m. And if you've ever flown into O'Hare, you know what I'm talking about. O'Hare's, kind of a busy place. And they knew that we were part of the Air Force One press group. And so from about 50 miles out of Chicago, we got a clearance direct to O'Hare. You're cleared to land, runway of your choice. And
well, you don't hear that very often, unless
certainly
it's an emergency.
Not going into O'Hare. And I just could imagine all these airplanes that they had to park out in holding patterns somewhere to let this happen. And these guys wondering, who the hell is that? Who does Pan Am think they are? So we landed at O'Hare. We flew right over the center of the airport and made a visual downwind leg, just like we were out at local airport, and landed, and we parked over at the National Guard facility. But one thing that the Air Force One trips did, Carter's barbecue trips notwithstanding, was they published a schedule, a day's schedule for the flights and when they were going to leave and what was going to happen at the various stops and when they would arrive and then when they would depart. And you could set your clock on when Air Force One arrived somewhere, and you'd watch them. If the scheduled arrival was 10:05, at 10:04 and 59, the nose wheel would make its last revolution to stop on the spot. And I asked one of the Air Force One navigators how they did that. How they were managed to be so accurate. And he said, one thing, it helps that we never have to wait for anybody. And he said, we time it usually from the outer marker. We know how long it's going to take us to fly and approach. We are familiar with the airports, or familiar enough to know that after we land, how long it'll take to get to where we're going to park. and we can speed up or slow down to a degree to make that happen. And he said, very seldom do we miss. And in my experience, that was very true. They rarely missed. So it was just a fun thing, and I was very privileged and honored to be selected as one of the guys to fly him at the Pan Am. I have no idea how they do it nowadays, or if they have a specified carrier that they like to use for White House charters or not. I've been out of it too long, but it was sure fun at the time.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for coming back on the program. John Marshall, celebrated Pan Am pilot, worked for Korean Airlines, FAA, was on the Pan Am podcast 3 times and counting, and also the China National Evening News.
Right.
Thank you again, Captain Marshall. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
All right, Tom. Thanks very much. Very much enjoyed it. Nice talking to you.
Pan Am was a pioneer in air travel and still stands as one of the most iconic and innovative airlines in aviation history. That legacy lives on at the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York, where you can explore the rich history of the aircrafts and individuals at the heart of the company known as the world's most experienced airline. For more information about the Pan Am Museum, check out our website at www.thepanammuseum.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. As was once a tagline in one of our commercials, we would greatly appreciate your support to help the Pan Am Museum continue making the going great. You can also support the museum by shopping on our online store for all things Pan Am, accessories, apparel, jewelry, books, models, and posters. We want to hear from you. If you have a question for us or want to share your story, our email address is podcast@thepanammuseum.org. We're going to close out this episode with the song Hail to the Chief, performed by the United States Marine Band. As flight crews once said to passengers departing for their destinations around the world, "Thank you for flying, Pan Am."